It is in the nature of buildings to offend. Buildings do harm. They demand sacrifices, and they're hard to avoid too. They tend to pop up where we didn't want them. Just when we made ourselves at home, they wipe out our memories and force us to make new ones. Nothing can sum up in a glance everything we think is wrong with the world, like a building can. There's so much not to like. We don't like who paid for them. We don't like who be in them. We don't like what they're for. And we don't like how they look. So what do we do about buildings we don't like? I don't know, but I heard that if you can't stand the way things are, there are two places where you can escape. You can try to change the future, or you can contemplate the past. Well, I'm one of those who likes to contemplate the past. So come along if you like, and who knows, maybe we'll make our way back. I'm going back to what many consider to be the golden age of offensive buildings. These are the buildings built in the decades after the end of World War II. All kinds of buildings were built in these decades, but when people talk about these buildings, one word comes up again and again. It's brutalism. It helps that no one knows exactly what it is. Architects didn't call their buildings this way for the most part. Brutalism was not a movement that they joined, the 3 principles or 5 points that they decided to follow. Brutalism was a word that floated around and stuck itself to buildings, often against their will. And if it stuck around, it must be because it captures something about building in this period. But what, exactly? Brutalism, it seems, is in the eye of the beholder. Maybe the word conjures up visions of pretentious architects of dubious ideologies playing artsy games with the backdrop of our lives. Or is it guiltless geniuses with the guts to build buildings as tough and complex as the cities in which they stood? Maybe we can look for brutalism somewhere between the place we know, the place that wronged us, inspired us, made us who we are, it stirred our blood and numbed our mind. Brutalism is between this place and an endless stream of images. You flip and you scroll, and it never ends, and it can make it easy to miss what might be the most important thing about brutalist buildings, and that is the amount of them. Brutalism was the golden age of controversial buildings. First, because it was an age that built a lot. And second, because so much of this building was done in a radically new way, which made its failures harder to take. For so many of us, this is when the world as we know it was first built up. Well, if you stay, I'm going to tell you about 3 things that were barely there before the brutalist building boom that are everywhere now. Okay, let's start from the beginning. Somewhere around the year 1950, cities all over the world were filled with rubble, decay, and backwardness of all kind. And then they started pouring concrete. Governments poured money into it and guided it along. Cement factories were set up. All of a sudden, bags of cement were everywhere. And it was powerful. It warped space and time. It restored rubble into buildings from the future that could withstand large earthquakes and explosions. The promises were endless. Concrete construction could solve social problems, develop countries, revive economies, cement new national identities in place. The gray sludge was pure potential that hardened into a fast track to progress. To cover it up was blasphemy. What was there to be ashamed of? Quite the contrary. Whatever could be made out of concrete was made out of concrete. Nothing was too sacred, especially not churches. After all, worship had been driving invention in buildings from time immemorial. What's a history of architecture but a sequence of spaces for worship? And the brutalist building boom added itself to this lofty list. This church was built in the 70s. In Vienna, all the way at the edge of the city, there's a hill, and on it, concrete blocks of different sizes balanced on top of each other, all pointing in different directions. If you squint, you might almost believe that an ancient civilization stacked up these blocks with help from outer space to make us forever wonder, how did they do it? carefully take out block by block to let in the light. And just before it falls down, look close, and it's a pixelated cave in motion, and it goes all the way back to the original sin, to that idea to honor a god by piling up some stones in an impossible way that got us into this whole mess to begin with. And then this church. It was built in the 60s in West Germany on a hill on the edge of a small town. A concrete tent pitched among the picturesque roofs. Pilgrims come here to see an image of the Virgin Mary that can cause miracles. They've been coming for centuries, and after the war, so many came that they needed a bigger church, and the new church for these new, disoriented times. Walls are roof, and roof is walls. These high peaks in the middle have eyes in them that let in just enough light to reveal their contours to those inside. Below the highest peak is the altar, with space for thousands of pilgrims around it and in front of it, enveloped in a mysterious darkness. And all around are small, quiet pockets of space, overlapping like petals of some cubist rose. About 50 years before this church was built, poet Rilke paced tormented over the cliffs along the Adriatic Sea when he heard a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of life itself. Who, if I cried out, would hear me among the angels' hierarchies? And even if one of them pressed me suddenly against his heart, I would be consumed in that overwhelming existence. For beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror, which we are still just able to endure. And we are so awed because it serenely disdains to annihilate us. Every angel is terrifying. And then there's this little church built in the 60s in a town in central France on the outskirts where they were building new housing. It's shaped like a hexagon, a geometric heart, maybe, but it's broken in half. The church is upstairs, actually. The two halves slope down toward the middle, where the light enters through the crack between them. One of the two designers of this church was obsessed with slopes. We've lived on horizontals and among verticals for long enough. It's time to live on inclined planes. Walls are roof, and roof is walls. Each half of the church is enveloped in a smooth concrete shell with almost no windows in it. About 100 years before this church was built, a vision of Virgin Mary appeared to a young woman named Bernadette. The church is dedicated to her, and its designers wanted to evoke the image of the cave in which she had her vision. But they also wanted to evoke a different kind of cave, a modern, man-made kind. They wanted to evoke a bunker. The other one of its designers was obsessed with bunkers. He was a child in Paris when the Nazis invaded, and now in the 60s he walked among the many bunkers they had left along the coast of France. He took photos of them, thought about them, watched them as they sloped into the sand, like some ancient alien tombs. After they blitzed through Western Europe, Nazis wanted to build a wall around it to hold it in place. The wall was made out of thousands and thousands of bunkers, like these ones with guns inside them, all made out of reinforced concrete. Never before had there been such an outpouring of concrete over the face of the earth, and the face of the earth would never be the same again. Concrete itself had changed in the process. It acquired new meanings. After the war, it became almost impossible for people to see a concrete surface without at some level thinking bunker, bombs, brutality, but also power and protection. Nazis were the avant-garde of bunkers. It seems like for them, it was more about form than function. They invented new kinds, like this tower bunker. They built this one in Vienna, but they also built similar ones in Berlin and Hamburg. The point of them was to lift the guns above the roofs of buildings so that they can blast away and shoot down the planes dropping bombs on the city. And they came in pairs, the main tower with the guns and the control tower that told it where to shoot. Then they built 3 pairs of these around the center of the city to protect it. But these tower bunkers weren't just supposed to be for protection. It was even more important that they looked like protection. People were terrified of bombing, and the purpose of these bunkers was to reassure them. The architect who designed them wanted to make them look like modern high-tech versions of medieval forts. something that people would immediately recognize as defense. And in the end, the bombs fell, buildings collapsed, bunkers were left standing, and people crowded into them to look for shelter. It was something new, something to get used to, looking at all that raw concrete poured into massive modern monoliths that could withstand the blasts of bombs. There was also something ancient and primitive about them. Maybe that's what made them so uncanny. Concrete itself is both modern and ancient. At its most basic, concrete is mud. Thousands of years ago, people figured out that there are certain kinds of ashes that when mixed with water create an alchemy that can bind crushed stones back together again, stronger than ever. Romans had the perfect ash at hand, and it allowed them to make extraordinary domes and vaults that lasted thousands of years. What was missing was industry for alchemy to become modern chemistry and engineering. That came in the 19th century. First, they figured out ways to industrially produce large amounts of the magic ash called Portland cement. Then they thought of putting iron rods into the gray sludge to give it tensile strength and all kinds of structural superpowers. And then they developed the manuals, handbooks, and techniques to calculate it to perfection, and concrete was reborn as a modern construction method. At first, most architects were squeamish about using it. The problem was that although cement could bind broken down stone back together and restore its strength, it couldn't restore its natural elegance. The structural superpowers of concrete came at a price of it looking like a synthetic gray sludge. And this gray sludge asked too much of architects. It asked them to give it shape and texture without giving them any solid ground on which to justify their choices. Other materials had some logic to them, it seemed. Some forms worked better with them than others. But what did concrete want? Did it want curves or straight lines? Did it want to float or sit heavy on the ground? Did it want to be smooth or rough, mass-produced or poured in place? Architects didn't know what to do with concrete because they could do almost anything with it, and for most, this was a step too far. They desperately looked for principles, for some logic to it. One ground on which it was always easy to justify concrete was practical. It was cheap, fire-resistant, and it could span wide spaces, perfect for giant machines and assembly lines of factories. This gave concrete a reputation for being modern, high-tech material of industry. For a while, a lot of architects clung onto this modern reputation of concrete. Some even tried to develop a new modern style of architecture around it. But the primitive and craft-based side of concrete was always there under the surface, making things more complicated. The gray sludge was ever threatening to spill out of the narrow molds into which they poured it and do something bizarre and irrational, to debunk theories, to defy logic and the laws of physics. The bombs and the bunkers set it free, unleashed it upon the world. For better or worse, the world was never going to build the same again, at least not this world. What was built out of concrete before the Second World War was but mock-ups for what was going to be built out of concrete in the decades to come. To enter into the post-war world, all squeamishness about concrete had to be abandoned. The Nazis had actually hired French construction companies to build the bunkers on the beach. After the war, there was no greater shame than to have profited from the Nazis. People were publicly shamed and ostracized for it. That is, those whom the post-war world could do without. So the construction companies that built the bunkers were left alone. There were factories to rebuild, roads to lay out, and 4 million homeless people to rehouse. And this is where another wannabe collaborator had to be forgiven. Not only was he not squeamish about concrete, but he was also not squeamish about making plans for how to rebuild the entire world with it. Yes, he had only built a few mock-ups before the war, but they were blueprints for a new way of life for everyone. He got to work right away, assembled a team. His old office was cold, full of dust and weeds, but it didn't matter. It was redemption time. Sure, the commissions would flow now, because how were they ever going to rebuild all that without him? After all, he wasn't just any architect. He was Einstein. He was Freud. He was Picasso. He was Le Corbusier.
I am inevitable.
Là dove c'era l'erba ora c'è una città e quella casa in mezzo al verde ormai dove sarà?